I truly do believe that this is both the very best time in the history of the universe, as far as we can tell, at least the history of this world, to make something, because the tools for creation have never been more easily gotten. They've never been cheaper. They've never been better. They've never been as diverse. And they truly are make things more accessible. So if you want to make something that has sort of been made already, like in terms of like a book, a movie, a song, some of the tools to do that are just about free, and which means almost anybody in the world can get their hands on it. So, and many of these things in previous generations were prohibitively expensive and really relegated to the elites. But now you can make a book that looks as good as a book that the hottest bestseller author can make, and you can distribute it. It costs very, very little to do. So that's, and then the new things that we're making that have been as well worn, like, web apps or websites and things like that, are also much easier than before. And even making hardware things, there's more and more tools. So it really is the best time in terms of tools. And then the second bit of that convergence is that we're at a moment right now where, in terms of what's ahead of us, it's a very rapidly expanding opening that we're on the cusp of all these very transformative technologies and trends that will produce more stuff and opportunities in the next 50 years than in the past 50 years, as much as that's hard to believe.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com. Kevin, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
It's really my honor and privilege to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure. So, I have known about your work for quite some time, ever since I came across the idea of 1,000 True Fans. And, I got a chance to hear you on the Tim Ferriss podcast and tear this new book apart. It's underlined, highlighted, dog-eared. But before we get to that, I want to start with a question that I am very personally curious about. And that is, what is your earliest childhood memory that planted the seed for all this work that you've ended up doing with your life?
I have a very, very bad memories of my childhood. I have almost none. And the earliest that might at all be related to anything that I'm doing now is I was a very avid model railroad kid. And I was obsessed with building a little world in my basement and working on these Lionel trains. And it wasn't so much the trains, it was the modeling, the making the houses and the grass and the mountains and all that kind of stuff. And I was sort of very resource bound, a little kid, no money, parents didn't have money. There was actually finding things, supplies was extremely difficult. This is pre-everything at that time. Older men who were into it, could, find stuff and go to places and make stuff. But as a kid, it was really tough. So I had to make things up myself. I got into kind of the making mode, and my next project after that in the basement was I made a nature museum. I discovered this book at the library called How to Make a Nature Museum, and I was following its instructions and making exhibits and reading science books and trying to make up my own new exhibits. I had kids in my neighborhood collecting for me, trying to get all the different trees and pressing the leaves, or collecting shells and butterflies and mounting them, etc. And my next project after that in the basement was I made a chemistry lab. So I built the benches and got for my birthday, all I asked for was glassware for years. It was just give me some test tubes, give me some chemicals. Um, I was not making, I was the only chemistry basement lab in the country that was not making bombs. I was actually doing experiments. And I was following the Golden Book of Chemistry, which is this amazing, now out of print, but you can find the PDF online. I mean, it was this really, you had to be making chlorine gas, hydrogen to hydrolysis, just, making nylon. It was really cool. And this is the 50s. And so it was a different era, a different attitude about chemistry. Chemicals were kind of cool. I grew up in northern New Jersey, where it was the chemical industrial complex of the world. So in the same way that Silicon Valley is cool to code, back then it was cool to be a chemist. And people were very. I would get chemicals from people who worked at Merck and other places, and ask them to give me a jar of something poisonous or hard to get, and they would do it. So those are the kind of early memories I had related to what I'm doing. I picked up a camera my family had somewhere very early in middle school, and I became interested in photography, and that later in high school became something that to me melded my interest in science and tech and art. So I remember trying to take pictures of squirrels from. I was in the third story of a house. I mean, there was a big tree, and I was trying to take squirrels, and you get these prints back, little brown egg prints, and the squirrel would be like the size of a period, and because they were so far away, and I realized that nature photography, you had to get like really, really close and be really, really patient. I didn't get far with nature photography, but I became much more interested in photography itself. So I was a kid that made stuff, a lot of stuff, and I read a lot of science books that I could, and I read a lot of science fiction. So it was definitely kind of nerdy maker, but I was also interested in art, so I did a lot of painting and making art stuff as well. So I was kind of a maker and a do-it-yourselfer. I discovered the Horth catalog when I was in high school, and that was like instant love because it was this, hippie do-it-yourself thing. Make your own house, make your own food, all that kind of stuff. So I remember in middle school, actually, I was trying to draw out plans about how to make a house that never threw anything away. Everything was recycled, because this is like in the 60s, way before that became fashionable. But by the 60s, people were starting to think about those, and I don't know where I got that because I wasn't reading papers, but I thought it was logical to make a completely recycled home, that you shouldn't throw anything away. Everything should be reused. So those are my earliest, maybe pertinent to what I'm doing now.
It's interesting because when I hear you describe that, what I'm hearing is this just consistent pattern of very sort of obsessive, immersive experiences with things that you were interested in and making. And I've seen a pattern like that in just about everybody who I've interviewed who seems to have found some semblance of a calling or some semblance of meaning in their work in life. I'm curious what you've seen as patterns in the people that you've been exposed to through, doing things like working at Wired, like co-founding Wired, and like all the people that you've worked with. What have you seen as patterns in people who find this kind of thing in their life?
I don't know enough about their early lives to know what they were like or how that shaped them. But I do know that later in life, basically when I met them, that one of the things that the kind of people that I sort of hang around and tend to gravitate to is their ability to think. You can call it many different things. I might call it laterally, think differently. And that's something that I think it's very hard to tell whether they do it naturally or whether they have practiced it. And I think it's probably both. I think there is a practice that they've evolved. They may have begun doing it naturally. I suspect so, but in any case, they actually, they have evolved it, and this ability is to look at the world a little differently, and that's not just important for artists, which is if you hang around with a real artist, it's kind of remarkable because they just see they really do see things differently. They look at something and there's something about kind of where they're standing in their mind that will see something that you don't see there at all. And if they're of any kind of repute or success, they may have a somewhat, I wouldn't call it consistent view, but they have a style. They have kind of a certain tinted glasses that kind of colors what they see differently, and they see something you can almost see and you can almost understand, or not even not quite predict, but you can kind of they have a certain perspective or style. But the ones that actually I respect the most are ones that don't even have that. They just constantly are kind of reinventing how they see it. They're seeing it 5 different ways, not just one different way. And that I think kind of requires a little bit of a practice, meaning that they'll see the world differently, and then you say, well, how about, can you see it another way? And they'll see it another way. And so that to me is very, very impressive. And the people that I kind of have the most admiration for today are able to do that. So it's this idea of cultivating a different way of looking at the world, or seeing the world and understanding the world, the kind of questions you ask. And it's always surprising and fun to be around because you never know what they're going to say. They'll do something very conventional. They'll have a different idea about it. And it's like, that's interesting. So I enjoy being around people like that.
What did being a photographer teach you about seeing the world differently, and how did that apply to the work that you ended up doing at Wired?
So that's the kind of one trite way of saying is that photography forced me out and forced me to look around to see. And I often take my camera with me as a crutch, basically, as a device that will force me to look, because otherwise I'm not looking really hard. And if I have a camera, then I'm kind of reminded or propelled to kind of look. And so that's one thing was a kind of like an excuse, but as a focus to pay attention to things. And I would go way out of my way to look at something or find something or inspect something or spend many hours on it, because I was with the excuse, with the reason that I was trying to photograph it and getting it just right. And so that would force me to be patient, to pursue, to go all the way, to go far. And so that alone was worth the hobby. But there's another angle, which is this, that I think very visually, and it's probably assisted by photography. I could have done that with painting, but I do even now, like when I'm writing, I basically try to describe something I see visually. And so I think visually, I think in terms of pictures and motions and shapes and diagrams and things like that. So for me to understand something, I really kind of have to see it in my mind, and so that's an important aspect that I think was in some ways assisted by thinking very visually and seeing the world through the lens.
All right. Well, I want to get into the ideas in this new book, The Inevitable. But I want to ask you, I want to start by asking about one thing that you said in the book. You said, right now in 2016 is the best time to start up. There's never been a better time with more opportunity, more openings, lower barriers, higher benefit risk ratios, better returns, greater upside than now. Right now, this minute, this is the moment that folks in the future will look back and say, "Oh, to have been alive and well back then." That really struck me because it's an overwhelmingly optimistic view of where we're at. So, can you tell me why you believe that, and then give us sort of an overview of the forces that are basically inevitable? Which I realize is a lengthy question.
So, I truly do believe that this is both the very best time in the history of the universe, as far as we can tell, at least the history of this world, to make something, because the tools for creation have never been more easily gotten. They've never been cheaper. They've never been better. They've never been as diverse. And they truly are make things more accessible. So if you want to make something that has sort of been made already, like in terms of like a book, a movie, a song, some of the tools to do that are just about free, and which means almost anybody in the world can get their hands on it. So and many of these things in previous generations were prohibitively expensive and really relegated to the elites. But now you can make a book that looks as good as a book that the hottest bestseller author can make, and you can distribute it. It costs very, very little to do. So that's, and then the new things that we're making that have been as well worn, like web apps or websites and things like that, are also much easier than before. And even making hardware things, there's more and more tools. So it really is the best time in terms of tools. And then the second bit of that convergence is that we're at a moment right now where, in terms of what's ahead of us, it's a very rapidly expanding opening that we're on the cusp of all these very transformative technologies and trends that will produce more stuff and opportunities in the next 50 years than in the past 50 years, as much as that's hard to believe. And so all the amazing things that we've had in the last 50 years, we're going to 10 times as many are going to be coming in the next 50 years. And so there's all these things before us that you can make with these new tools that are now cheap and ubiquitous. So that's that's just amazing. So this is good news for anybody who wants to make something happen, and that you should be encouraged that all the good ideas are not behind us; they're all in front of us. That the kind of the degree of impact that, say, motors had on the world, or electricity had on the world, or printing had on the world, are going to pale compared to some of the things that are coming up. And they're likely to occur in the next 30 years, and you are going to be alive at that moment, and you have access to the tools. And so this is something that people should be rejoicing in, and maybe in my little scenario, people in the future will look back with envy that we were here at this time and had all these opportunities and could have done amazing things if we had wanted to.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because I, for the very first time, got to see somebody who had been on vacation in Costa Rica and shot aerial footage with a drone camera. And it looked like the opening sequence to a Hollywood film.
Right.
And he said, yeah, he's like, you can buy these drone cameras for like $100 on Amazon.
Right.
So
yep.
I guess the question then is, can you give us an overview of what the 12 forces are, for people who, aren't familiar with the book or your work, what those forces are and how they're going to impact our lives?
So I selected kind of 12 umbrella categories, and each of these trends, these forces, these leanings, the tilts, um, could be divided up in different ways, and there are in fact feeding each other and kind of codependent. They're kind of braided together in an intertwined way so that they are all self-reinforcing, and you could untangle them in a different way. So these categories are somewhat arbitrary in that sense, but uh, among them are this idea that we're going to increase the amount of tracking in our lives and capture, recording, and ultimately surveillance. All these that everything we do, anything that can be tracked will be tracked. Anything that can be measured will be measured, and we'll just kind of keep going in that direction. So the same thing could be said about sharing. We're nowhere near peak sharing right now. We're going to be sharing more and more, and I don't mean sharing just like in swapping photos. I mean collaborating, cooperating. That's what this technology is doing. It's increasing the range and the reach and the speed at which we are able to collaborate and cooperate with each other, making things that we could not be made with because we can now have 100,000 people or 1,000,000 people or 1,000,000,000 people together working at the same time on something, collaborating, cooperating at scales, even planetary scales. This is all new in the diversity and the different ways in which we can do sophisticated sharing, collaboration. And we're also cognifying, meaning we're making everything smarter. We're making some very inert things more lifelike. We're making dumb things smarter. We're making smart things very smart. So this artificial smartness is permeating our lives, and it will have an impact on life way beyond what happened when we electrified and motorized everything, when we added artificial power and energy to all that we did, so we didn't have to rely just on muscle power of animals ourselves or in our beasts. We actually made artificial power, which built skyscrapers and trains and highways and factories and all this stuff because we could harness artificial power. And now we're going to harness artificial intelligence, artificial minds, and that's going to have a second transformation way beyond what happened with the Industrial Revolution. And so the fact that things are going to be made smarter and smarter every year is inevitable. There are things like increasing the shift from owning things to accessing things. Because if you can deliver everything on demand in real time, anywhere, anytime in the world, that's in many cases better than owning it. So there's a little bit of a shift away from ownership, which, by the way, is the foundation of capitalism. So that's a big shift. And we are also increasing and shifting and overturning the way we manage attention. I suggest we may even get paid eventually for our attention, to watch an ad, to read an email. Right now, advertising has a big outsized role in the internet world, but that could shift if we shifted the economics of attention. So what we're seeing is that there's more and more filtering, more and more curating, more and more that's necessary just because of the sheer number of things that we make. So there's our attention is limited, and all the other things that we're making are growing exponentially. So there has to be a new economics around attention. Because we simply will see a smaller percent of everything that is made. So those are the general kinds of things. As I said, I have roughly 12 of them, including the shift from getting answers from from answers being a foundational value to becoming a commodity. So if you want an answer, you ask a machine, it will tell you the answer. Answers become cheap and ubiquitous. And I think we shift to valuing questions, uncertainty, much more than we do now, because a good question in a world of free answers, a good question becomes more valuable. And so we have this shift to questioning. So I forget how many I've done, but it goes on from there. You get the general idea.
Yeah.
And that these are, I use verbs because there's the other shift is a shift from nouns, from solid things, to processes, to services. So this shift from kind of atomic solids to dematerialized intangibles. And that's the general shift. That's been showing in our economy that we that we have this intangible, idea-based, bit-based world of services and processes, and everything wants to be seen within the framework of how things become things. So this becoming idea. That's the and so all the trends are verbs or gerunds or present particles. They're general ongoing movements.
So, what are the implications of all of this for our social relationships and human behavior as we see all of these advances happening?
Yeah. Well, there's certainly going to be pushback. There's certainly, I mean, humans actually don't like change. I mean, we crave it and we crave novelty, but at the same time, we biologically are lazy. I mean, are just we're a very complex system. Our bodies, our minds are a very complex system that are resistant on first glance to change. They're kind of built in a certain sense to not fundamentally change, though they're pretty plastic. Our minds are fairly plastic, even as adults. Our bodies can learn, but it requires energy. So there is kind of a resistance, a built-in resistance to change that has to be overcome. So there will be, so a lot of this stuff is going to require new habits. I call it techno-literacy, where they're just, we're going to become perpetual newbies, always having to learn new stuff. And that is a little bit of exhausting. That's tiresome. It's like, well, how many languages do I need to know? How many interfaces do I need to master? How many menus do I need to really become proficient in, and so I can rest? And the thing is, there is no rest. There's just going to be ongoing, and that's hard, and there is. How many careers do I need to have in my career? How many jobs do I need to have in my career? And the answer is going to be a lot of them. How many job titles? You're going to be constantly changing. And so that for some people, that was not the bargain that they grew up with or were taught. And I think it'll be tough. I think there's going to be some tough times for many people. But I firmly believe that people are capable of change, and they'll need help. I think that's why the government's here. I think the government is there. I'm a big believer in the role of a communal action, which is what we call the government. Socialism. That's what government is. Government is socialistic by definition, and so I think that we can, with help, move people, if they're willing, to this new era where lifelong learning becomes the major skill that you want. It doesn't really matter kind of what language you learn, as long as you can learn languages. It doesn't really matter what gestures or interface you learn, as long as you can learn new ones. And so that meta skill, the meta skill of critical thinking, which becomes more important when we move into this era where authorities don't have as much weight, where you have to assemble your own truth on the screen rather than from the authorities of authors and books. So it's so there's a set of kind of basic essential meta skills that I think should be taught not just to children but to adults. And I think, of course, obviously our educational systems are really not set up for that, but that I think is part of the transformation that we will continue. It'll take a generation or two to move into, particularly as we kind of go into a post-industrial economy and society where all the things that people have been talking about for a long time are kind of materializing or dematerializing, I should say. And so there is going to be conflict, and I don't think we know everything. I think probably don't know very much about how humans are. I mean, we keep discovering that we're not only discovering what it means to be humans, but we're also at the same time inventing what it means to be human. We're very malleable in the evolutionary sense. We're still forming ourselves, and so we are ahead of us. We are inventing who we want to be slowly, while at the same time we try to adapt to the things that we're making.
So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable. So you brought up two things. You mentioned both jobs and education, two things that I knew I wanted to ask you about. The first is around jobs. And, I heard Chris Sacca on this Q&A podcast that Tim did with him kind of have almost a dystopian view of the future where we're going to have the 1% and everybody else is going to be driving their Ubers and serving them lattes. And you also mentioned that we're going to have multiple jobs and job titles throughout the course of our lifetime. So, I mean, what is that going to look like based on kind of where we're headed and the trends that you've kind of seen? Like, I know that there are so many jobs even today that didn't exist, even 10 years ago.
Yeah. I think some of what Chris was saying, I think there is an element of truth to that, in the sense that when we look at the kinds of jobs that can be given to the bots with their AI robots in the next 30 years, the way I would describe it is any kind of a role or task that can be defined in terms of efficiency will be a job that we give to the bots. And so that's just whether it's manual labor or knowledge work. If it's something where efficiency matters, then we give it to the bots, and that leaves us humans with a pretty wide open field of things where efficiency is not so critical. And if you think about science, which is fundamentally built on one failure after another, that's terribly inefficient. And innovation is, by definition, inefficient, because you're trying stuff that doesn't work. You're trying stuff. You're prototyping. You're spending a lot of time on things that may be a dead end as you try to figure out the best solution. And so this innovation is inherently an inefficient process. And so, by the way, is human relationships. Anything in which humans are working with other humans, this is inherently an inefficient time. You don't want productivity in there. And so, in a certain sense, some of the service relationships are inefficient in that sense. In a certain sense, when you are having help from somebody, you don't want them to be concerned about efficiency. You want them to be concerned about effectiveness. And so there is one sense in which some of the things that humans will do will be working with other humans. And right now we kind of tend to denigrate that, but I think over the long term we may come to value that, because we humans cherish that kind of interaction. And so things, anything that's efficient or about productivity goes to the bots, and we're left with all the rest. And it's like having a nurse sit by your bedside for long periods of time is very inefficient, but very, very comforting to us. And so I think we will pay for that's something that we'll begin to pay for, and maybe even appreciate more. And so some of that kind of time is where humans are going to go, but it's also, I think, where we'll come to value even more. And so, like, having a house call, having somebody come to your house to fix something is not very efficient, but it's, I mean, from one standpoint, but it's something that we like. And so I think there may be a service component, but that service may actually become to be seen as something that's very valuable.
Okay, so outside of the obvious sort of, low level, serving lattes and driving Ubers, places where you could easily replace somebody with a bot, what are the not so obvious careers that, people are in where they may not be thinking that, hey, this is replaceable by a robot? Like, what are we overlooking, do you think?
I mean, there's so many. I mean, I was just, Jan Chipchase, a friend who does a lot of traveling, did a little workshop on auto-driven cars, and they were coming up with a whole bunch of different occupations that might relate. And there was one that was sort of called, he would call them dringers. They were called dringers. They were ring drivers. It was sort of like, for a while, there'll probably be parts of the world or a neighborhood or something that aren't easily driven by robot cars. So these are kind of like when boats come into a foreign harbor, there's pilot boats who actually get on, take over from the captain, and they navigate through the shoals at the harbor. And that's their whole job, is just to go through this really kind of dangerous place. And so he was imagining these guys called dringers that would kind of wait around areas where it was really, really tough to navigate with auto-driven cars, and they would drive those cars to these little parts and then they get out. And you had these kind of dringers, and their job was to kind of do the really, really hard driving that AIs had not yet mastered. And that was sort of an interesting take on it, which is, again, something I talk about in the book, which is you kind of the humans working with AIs together. They're kind of like partners, and sometimes they do one job and then your AI does another. The kinds of things I think, just take the auto-driven, all the truck drivers who will probably lose their jobs. I think there's still a huge amount from, by the way, repairing, AI repairmen. If there are all these AIs around, then what we know from technology is that they're going to break, and so there will be a huge, it's kind of like the IT world of people who keep your IT going. There's a huge thing of just people keeping the AIs going, or keeping the AI trucks going, from both the mechanical part to the other parts of it. That's not to be underestimated. And it's both kind of a manual job, but also it's a cerebral job. It's both. It's this combination of kind of high tech. They're repair guys, but nonetheless, it's a very techy job, and I think there's going to be a huge need for that at the very least. We call them Rannies, so kind of like a robot nanny, people who are really good at keeping these things going. And I think that's going to be, it's kind of like horse wrangler, just keeping these beasts happy is going to be a pretty big thing. And beyond that, I think there's people tweaking the routes who trying to I'm just sticking with this idea of auto-driven cars. I think there's just tons and tons of unexpected roles that we would be managing. What people do inside of them is going to be a huge thing. Some people think that we're going to do VR, that what we'll do while we're being driven around is VR. And that's very, very possible. But there could be, I don't know, you could have a course. Someone could get in and teach, or maybe there's parties. It's hard to imagine. I think I'm not really worried at all about the new jobs that will come up. I think we'll be surprised, and I think we'll be surprised by how many new types of careers and roles and tasks that are going to come up. They'll be as weird to us as a web designer was to a farmer 150 years ago. Because you tell them, hey, you're going to lose all your farming jobs. 70% of Americans were farmers. You're all going to get pink slips. And they said, what are you going to do? He said, you're going to be a web designer. You're going to be a mortgage broker. You're going to be a yoga teacher. And they were, well, this doesn't make any sense. No, it doesn't make any sense then. And these new jobs won't make any sense either. And to me, they're just going to be this never-ending surprise of the ways in which people will figure out new desires, new wants, things that we didn't even know we wanted. It's going to be amazing.
What about education? What kinds of changes can we expect to see? And I mean, what kind of changes do we need to see in order to be prepared for this future?
Education is probably one of the most conservative, industries, I guess you might say, in America. And the thing about education is that the reform necessary for it has, one, been long. Everybody's been aware of this for a long time. And secondly, there have been so much work, so many charter programs, pilot programs. We know exactly how to do this. But doing it at the scale of this country is just, it's not a knowledge problem. It's not even a technology problem. It's just it's a matter of political will. It's an agreement on it. And so I don't even, it's sort of like, you just point to the different schools in which good stuff are being done and say, yeah, they know how to do it. How we get that on a wide scale, especially particularly to the disadvantaged kids of this country and beyond, I don't know. But it's a problem that we do know how to solve. It's a tractable, solved problem. It's just it's a matter of executing it, and that I don't know how that happens.
All right, so I have one other question for you. One of the things you did throughout the book is you sort of described what a day in your life looks like in the future. And I was wondering if you might give us a glimpse into that, because I thought that was one of the most fascinating parts of the entire book. Like, what does a day-to-day routine look like 20 years from now?
Well, what I didn't do in the book, which I wish I could have, which is sort of beyond me, was integrate all the different little vignettes that I developed for each of those 12 trends, these 12 forces. And that would have made to put them together into kind of a single day would have been the obvious thing for a better person than I to do, and it was just it's just a little bit more difficult, and I haven't done that. So I think I think let's take the time horizon of say 25 years, 20 to 30 years. Um, the most obvious difference, I think, will be the degree to which AI has permeated our lives, even though most of it won't be visible. It's not visible in the way, say, like the AIs between Netflix recommendation or the Amazon recommendation engine, which are very sophisticated AIs, are operating. You're not aware of them being AIs. They're just throwing up suggestions for books. But that's the level of kind of enterprise, corporate, boring utility commodity AI that will be operating, which is behind the scenes. We're not going to see very much of it, but yet it'll have huge impact on modeling our lives. There'll be a few outward-facing AIs, and I suspect that the mode of interaction, the interface, will be conversational and gestural. So the little hint of the Amazon Echo, Alexa, and Siri, Google Now, where you talk to these things, and they kind of like the movie Her, where there is where you're having a conversation with them, and that conversation will, I think, deepen over time and become very complex for many people. And so the way I might suggest is that the internet in 25, 30 years will be more of a conversation, a presence that we experience rather than a place that we go to. It's just this kind of all ongoing presence that is kind of like a GPS for our life. So imagine, how you go down a road with GPS, and you may know somewhat of a route, and you disobey the instructions, you kind of cut earlier, or you make a mistake, whatever it is, and the GPS is very ready with an alternative route, and it's anticipating your arrival time and all kinds of stuff, where you're going to turn next. And so if you again detour from that route, there's no problem. They've got another one, and so in some ways there'll be a GPS for our life, in the sense that these AIs are anticipating what you're doing. They're getting stuff ready for you, for your figuring out you're going to go to lunch now. You'll be over here. I'll have this ready for you, and you decide, no, I'm not going to do that. And then no problem. I have another plan for you. I have this will be ready for you. Oh, I don't want to do that. Okay, well then no problem. There's this forever patient anticipation of us in our lives. That I think will be something that within 30 years we'll definitely have as an outward-facing AI. So the sense of a GPS for our life will be part of that. That's just AI. We can go on from there.
Okay, so one other one I was curious about. I know you did a nice vignette on the tracking, which I just found fascinating. I thought, wow, that would fundamentally change my eating habits, because you mentioned this idea of popping a pill, which would have your vital signs throughout the day. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that, and we'll wrap things up.
Yeah. So the idea there is if you kind of extrapolate the degree to which we're self-tracking, friends are tracking, companies track, government track, we're going to really be totally tracked. And by the way, VR is a totally tracked world. All your emotions are captured and theoretically can be tracked and kept and archived and processed. But in the health realm, there's great advantages to being tracked. And one of the proposals, one of the scenarios is where you have a little pill making machine. They call it the 3D pill printer or something. But it's taking a bunch of different supplements or medicines that you may be prescribed to take, and they're in kind of bulk form of some sort. And what the machine does is it generates one capsule a day that has all the different things you're supposed to be taking in the appropriate dosages, but that those dosages are reconfigured and rebalanced the next day based on the evidence of the drug's effects on you that day. So you're wearing sensors of all different types that can pick up the effects of the drugs. And so what you have is every day you have a personalized pill that's based on the evidence of the previous day or in the previous weeks or months. It's cumulative things, but it's in real time. So it's constantly doctoring you by adjusting what you take based on the evidence of the previous day and beyond. And so that's just one way we have personalized medicine, which is sort of the hope of a lot of this tracking is that your normal and the way you get sick is unique. It really is. It's your normal is not my normal. You know, all these normals values change by day, by the season, by the time of our life, and with your own genetics and whatnot. What you really do want to have very, very personalized therapeutics, personalized attention, and the hope of tracking all this stuff, getting a baseline for many years, tracking it in real time, tracking many variables at once allows us to do that. And that's one of the promises of the quantified self, is that you could have personalized medical therapy.
Do you think that we're going towards a place where we're going to be able to prolong human life significantly? And if so, how does that fundamentally change the meaning of what it means to be human at that point?
I am agnostic about the life extension possibilities. I can look at the current trends of increasing life. I don't know whether it plateaus off. I don't know whether it becomes exponentially more difficult as we get closer to, or as we get higher. I don't know. I don't know enough about it to have an opinion other than I can, repeat several different sides of the story. Some people who think that there's asymptote that we're headed towards, and others who think that it's open-ended and infinite. And then, of course, the question is at what speed. My book deals with a 20 to 30 year horizon. And so beyond that, it's like, I have no idea. But within a 20 to 30 horizon, I think we will extend life some more years, but I don't think we're going to substantially extend it. But I could be wrong because I don't really know.
Well, this has been really, really fascinating. So I have one last question, which is how we finish all our interviews at the Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Unmistakable. Well, I think it goes back to a little bit what I was saying in the beginning about this ability, this tendency to see things differently. I mean, I think every person on the planet, past, present, and future, has a slightly different mix of talents, just like our faces are different. And that's what we use technology for. That there are part of what technology is about is to invent different ways that mix of talents can be expressed and shared. And so whether that means inventing the musical instrument so that the genius of a Mozart or a Beethoven can be expressed and shared, or if inventing the technology of cinema so that Lucas or Alfred Hitchcock's genius can be expressed and shared. And so just imagine the world, if we had never invented that technology, what a loss to them and to us that would have been. And so there are people born today whose technology have not been invented. And in a certain sense, we have a moral obligation to try and invent as many different types to enable more people to express their genius. But I think what unmistakable means is not just having that technology available, but actually being able to come to discover what it is about your mix that's particularly distinctive. And for those people who either have and found that venue, that way to express their mix, then we call them unmistakable. And it's in part because they are not, they're not living someone else's movie. They're in their own movie, and they are kind of unmistakable in the sense that when that person is doing something, there's really nobody else who can kind of do it like they're doing. And that's just like they have a face that's different from other people's faces. And so their work is characteristic of them, just as your face is. So I think as most people have an unmistakable face, I think, I hope that we can all grow to have unmistakable lives in that same sense. And that it's a little bit harder to do than your face, because you have to kind of actually create it. It's like you're born with this invisible face that you have to sort of find or discover to reveal to others. And that takes most of your life to do. Your life is sort of about figuring out what your life is. I mean, that's the joke. It takes all your life to figure out what all your life is about. And some people kind of come earlier to that than others. But in any case, it takes a lot of work and dedication to actually try and do that, and not to live in other people's movies, but to live in your own movie.
Well, this has been just amazing and fascinating and riveting, as I kind of expected it would be. So where can people learn more about you?
I can be found at my initials, kk.org, where I have a page for the book and its translations, The Inevitable, 12 Forces Shaping Our Lives, and other books that I've done, and other websites and blogs like The Cool Tools, where every weekday for the past 13 years, I've been recommending a great cool tool. I have True Films, which is the website dedicated to where I review the best documentaries available, and Silver Cord, and I have a new blog called Extrapolations, where I'm gathering with my researcher, Camille, all the long-term forecasts for the future. So stuff like that, it's all there. I'm Kevin to Kelly on Twitter. And my email has been public for 20 years and is buried on my site somewhere. I'm sure you can find it.
Awesome. Well, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to join us and share all of this with our listeners. This has been just awesome.
Great. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.